You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Well, hello and welcome to Whistleblower Nation here on Revolution Radio, and I'm your host, Ella. Thank you for joining me again this week. First off, what is a whistleblower? A whistleblower is a person who makes public disclosures of wrongdoing, corruption, and crime. These courageous people often suffer retaliatory actions because of their disclosures, and I'm here to celebrate these people and give them a platform because shining a light on wrongdoing wherever it occurs plays an important role in keeping society peaceful, free, and just. So with me today, I have a returning guest. I have Coleen Rowley. Coleen, do we have you there?
Yes, you do.
Great. So I'm going to give you guys a little bit of background about her. She was here last week, as I mentioned, and we were able to do an hour interview, and we talked a little about her background and some of the circumstances around her whistleblowing. But this week we're going to go into a little more detail about the circumstances that surrounded the disclosure and the events around that. So first off, a little bit about her again. Coleen Rowley is a retired FBI special agent and former Minneapolis Division legal counsel who taught constitutional law and law enforcement ethics to FBI agents and other law enforcement, then became a whistleblower about the FBI's pre-9/11 failures, testifying to the Joint Intelligence Committee inquiry, the Senate Judiciary Committee, and the Inspector General staff of the Department of Justice. She was named, along with two other corporate whistleblowers, as Time People magazine's Person of the Year in 2002, and she was also on the cover. In early March 2003, she warned FBI Director Robert Mueller of further problems, including his going along with the Bush administration's deceptive plan to launch war on what would become the counterproductive war on Iraq, a country that had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks. Sadly enough, despite all facts to the contrary, the Bush administration was able to fool 70% of the American public into believing that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11. Since retiring from the FBI, Rowley continues to write and speak out about the perpetual global war on terror that has exponentially increased terrorism worldwide and made the situation far worse. I guess you would agree with that, correct, Coleen?
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell, and it's not over. We're heading into the 17th year now of perpetual war, as well as reduced civil liberties and really adherence to the law, which there should be a lot more whistleblowers about because it just seems to get worse and worse.
Yeah, definitely. And so to go back a little bit, we'll touch upon some of what we talked about last week. You know, you were a legal person in the FBI, and you were an ethics teacher, and you had just given like a PowerPoint presentation 1 week prior to 9/11. And so ethics to you were of the highest of importance, and upholding the Constitution was what you were taught to do. And so then some things were brought to your attention, and can you tell the listeners what happened exactly?
Well, beginning, this really wasn't brought to my attention that much. I was aware a little bit of it, but beginning already in spring of 2001 and throughout the summer of 2001, there was a lot of intelligence flowing into all agencies of the intelligence community, not just the FBI. Of course, the CIA and the NSA had even far more intelligence that an attack was going to occur. That they didn't share everything with the FBI, but the FBI also had its own intelligence coming in, and so there was a lot. And if they, afterwards they said if they would have connected the dots, they could have prevented 9/11. Essentially, these officials in all of these agencies were not reading the intelligence. Either were not reading, or after 9/11, they denied having even received those memos. They denied even having seen them or read them or anything. They denied sharing the information with other agencies, with other officials in the same agency, and they didn't act on the intelligence. And so, but you would never have known that after 9/11. Of course, they used the shock and awe, the kind of the trauma of 9/11 was exploited very opportunistically on several levels. One level was to begin war, that they had wanted to do. These war hawk think tanks, neocon think tanks, had been plotting to start war on the Mideast, essentially, but beginning with Iraq. they'd been plotting that for years before. And they said, if we got a new Pearl Harbor, well, they used 9/11 then as their new Pearl Harbor. And there's, in the books that have come out where people have written their biographies, people in the cabinet, in Bush's cabinet, they said that even within days, short day after, they were already saying, oh, now that we had the attack happen, look, we can use this to gin up war on Iraq. So, but that was just one thing. The other thing that was very serious here, and it really deals with my legal background, was that they basically commissioned John Yoo, a junior attorney in the Office of Legal Counsel, who partnered up with a senior fellow, and they began then to write dozens of memos that essentially said the Constitution no longer is in force. And they didn't say it in so many words. I'm really kind of what's the word? I'm telling you what the memo said, but you got pages and pages and pages, and they basically were very convoluted, hard to read. But they said that the Bill of Rights, the freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom against warrantless searches, not based on probable cause, freedom against self-incrimination, i.e. torture. They went through the laws in these series of memos and basically said, now that we're in war, we don't have to follow the Constitution anymore. And again, there was a whole series of them. It's not just one. There were hundreds of pages. And very few people have even read these at this point. The ACLU has looked at some of them. You know, some attorneys have looked at some of them, but almost nobody has read them all. But they constructed under the law of war, you can establish a form of martial law. Martial law is a misnomer. It means the absence of law. It's, you know, Lincoln tried to do this in the Civil War when he had editors rounded up for writing things that were critical of the Union. So this happens in wartime, and it was one of those opportunistic things that began right after 9/11, a whole series of illegal actions. And like I said, now we're 17 years out, or we're into our 17th year out from that start, and essentially nothing has been fixed. If anything, it's been rubber stamped now by Congress, and you know the public has gotten desensitized to almost all of it. We just assume we're going to be in perpetual war forever, and we've been accepting of the fact that we're going to be under surveillance. Americans will be under surveillance. We'll have harsh interrogation tactics, and we'll launch wars on foreign countries. I mean, all these things that we've just come now after all these years to accept, little by little. It's pretty frustrating, you know. There's something said about whistleblowers. If you go back, there's that old myth of Cassandra, that she was doomed to keep warning about really horrible things that were going to happen, but people would not pay attention to her, and then the worst would happen. That was this old myth of Cassandra. And you know, it's a horrible thing to warn about something that even threatens public safety, and then, you know, have people, oh, well, it does, who cares, blah, 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 and then have it happen. And now what can the person, you know, who warned you, can't say, oh, I told you so, and millions of people have died. That doesn't work. And it's just a real sad situation to have so few of the public educated enough and understanding of the framework of the law enough to care and try to put some pressure on their elected government in order to return. You know, if you use the framework of 9/11, there were the color codes, the green, yellow, red. And of course, people thought after a few years, I think it took about 6, 7, 8 years before someone said, well, that's kindergarten to say we're in yellow alert or orange alert or red alert. You know, red alert, by the way, is Armageddon. So they said, well, that doesn't make any sense. And by the way, we can never go back to green. Green was normal. You know, green was considered to be normal. I think we do have to try to get back to what we had, where we had a government that was at least trying to follow the law,
right,
and that was, you know, not doing these terrible things. But It's very, very difficult right now because people are afraid and they'll believe anything.
Yeah. And then do you mind going back into your particular story? Because I want to hear about your memo, and I know you were up all night and you were going to go the next day and share it. Can you maybe expound upon that? And I'd love to hear about it. And, I want to keep this about you and what you actually did. So I would love that.
Well, if anyone is really interested in this history of 9/11, there's a site on the web called History Commons. It's kind of like Wikipedia. And if you put in Musawi History Commons, you will find pages and pages, and the factual statements are just like Wikipedia. They're all footnoted and linked to whatever news article or authority. And so maybe not all of it is correct, of course, because it will depend upon the underlying news report that was the source of authority for that statement. But I just happened to review that the other day. And over time, when they first started History Commons, it wasn't that accurate because it's like Wikipedia. When a Wikipedia thing just starts, heaven knows if it's accurate. But over time, public source, people, open source works because people go in there and correct this and correct that. And if you're really interested in the history of the terrorist suspect that was detected in Minnesota in August of 2001, you should read that whole long pages of Musawi on History Commons. It's quite accurate. And even I was shocked to see how much information later was discovered that of Musawi's different earlier terrorist actions in Europe and in Chechnya and whatever. But in August, there are two calls that come from whistleblower flight engineers and flight instructors in a flight school in Eagan, Minnesota. And these two flight engineer instructors did not even know they were calling. They were whistleblowers because their bosses told them to keep quiet about it. And so they both call the FBI to different places and they say, we've got this unbelievably most suspicious student we've ever seen. And we think he could be, planning some kind of terrorist attack, whatever. One of our agents then, who really was probably the best agent equipped in the office to follow up on that lead because he himself had been in Navy intelligence and he had been, I think he was either a flight, a pilot or else a flight person that helps on Navy flights. He's the person that that locates or whatever. But he was an agent. And that very day, within hours, he and another INS agent went out to interview Musawi, who was this French-Moroccan flight student in Eagan. And they interviewed him. First, by the way, they interviewed his own flight instructor, who also said, oh, yes, he's the most suspicious student we've ever had, and gave those agents literally pages of facts about why he was suspicious. The agents went back to the office. Oh, I should back up. They took Musawi into custody after interviewing him because they were so afraid that he was in the midst of planning a terrorist attack, and also because his visa had lapsed. So they took him into custody along with his personal effects and laptop. INS did, by the way, because of his visa. Then the agents put all those facts down into an emergency request for a FISA. This is ironic because now today there's a memo released by the Republican staffers about all of the irregularities and false information that went into the FISA application for one of the Trump campaign volunteers. And of course, that's created huge news that that the FBI misled the FISA court on its surveillance of Carter Page, one of the Trump campaign people, calling him a Russian spy, all based on specious, what they called the dossier, etc. So that's all over the news. Our agents back in August of 2001, requested an emergency FISA on Musawi so that they could search his personal effects and laptop. And our headquarters, and then also they sent out leads to France and the United Kingdom. And so they did all of this very quickly. And what happened was our headquarters then, over the course of a few days, basically blocked that request from going to the Department of Justice, even from even going to their superiors inside the FBI. They didn't even they took it up one level, but they did not take it up any further than one level. And they didn't take it over, of course, to the Department of Justice, and certainly not to the FISA court. And so our agents were pulling their hair out in August, trying to think of all kinds of other ways. They called to the CIA. In the meantime, this info that they had gotten initially was briefed to George Tenet, who was the director of Central Intelligence. He got briefed already on August 23rd and was briefed, I think, more than once, and no one knows if he briefed the president about it or not, but we know that Tenet himself knew. Tenet, people didn't understand this because they thought no one was in charge of the 16 intelligence agencies, and that's why they all had to create a new office of director of intelligence afterwards. That was a lie. They already had somebody in charge. It was the director of Central Intelligence, which was George Tenet. And he didn't want to take responsibility, so they made it seem like there was no one in charge. But he received this information on August 23rd. There was all kinds of things like that were being covered up after 9/11. And they covered up the Phoenix memo. They covered up all of these. Part of the problem for the FBI was the CIA had not shared critical intelligence about a meeting that had been monitored by the CIA like 2 years before in Kuala Lumpur. And two of the people at that Al-Qaeda meeting in Kuala Lumpur came to California. And they turned out to be the pilot hijackers. They were part of the group of terrorist hijackers. But the CIA never told the FBI. So there were all these things that were being covered up. And still to this day, even though my memo did lead to a Inspector General report, if you read the 9/11 Commission, you'll see cites to the Inspector General report. I think some of it is also on the History Commons site. And so some of the information eventually, it took a long time, a couple of years, even for, some of the information to come out. But to this day, there's been cover-up of a lot. Just last year, they finally uncovered 28 pages that they had blocked, which showed that Saudi Arabia, which should have been no surprise, because 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, but there was a lot of investigation that showed Saudi Arabian officials had helped or in some ways aided the hijackers. And that was covered up until last year. It's pretty incredible. We're in all these wars with countries that had nothing to do with 9/11. And to this day, our intelligence people have covered up a lot of the truth about 9/11, that if we'd known those things, they could have been fixed. An easy fix, for instance, to some of the problems of not reading your memos that come to you, not sharing the information. Well, that kind of stuff is a lot more easily fixed. You can put in accountability mechanisms to ensure that people read when their name is on it. They basically have to have some way of initialing off to show that they've read it. And then, of course, if afterwards something bad happens, that person is not able to deny that they didn't see that memo. So that's a very simple thing to fix. Very simple to fix. A major problem, people denying that they got memos. Very easy to fix. Also the sharing of info, that's easy to fix. A lot easier than killing millions of people in countries that had nothing to do with the 9/11 hijackers. And in fact, covering up the country that did have something to do with it.
Right.
So it's a mess. If we were from another planet and we were looking down on this, you would just have your mouth would be open because you wouldn't believe that you could do these things. But because we're all part of this partisan blind loyalty, kind of this manipulation that goes on from the politicians on down of both parties, we're really in the dark to a large extent. The Americans really have not ever figured out that they've been bamboozled for a long time. And it's a sad and dangerous, extremely dangerous moment that we're living through now.
Yeah, seems to be so. But I was reading some of your previous interviews, and in 2008, you stated that you had taken a copy of your Bombshell memo to the media, and it probably saved your job. Can you elaborate on this a little bit?
Yeah, I did not take it to the media. So I don't know what that was not exactly true. But when 8 months after 9/11, when the Joint Intelligence Committee was finally convening, they had, 30 staffers that they divvied up and assigned to FBI, CIA, NSA, and others. I think FAA maybe. So they had different investigators staffers that they assigned. So the FBI had 5 or 6 that just dealt with FBI problems, and then they had some with NSA. That started 8 months, 8.5 months, it started before that. It started about 6 months, 7 months after 9/11. But it really got going where I got a call 8 months later. And so I had to go to Washington, D.C., and because I was afraid that I would forget some of these details, because again, it's a complicated thing, I started jotting them down because I said, when you're talking to somebody, you always leave things out. And I said, I want to be very complete and tell everything I knew about this Moussaoui case. I didn't know very much. By the way, when you look at the whole scheme, a vast amount of stuff out there, the Moussaoui is just a small portion of it. So, and I only knew about the Moussaoui case, but I wanted to jot it down. But as I jotted it down, I had about a 3-day lead time before I had to go to DC. I started to write it into more of a memo form, and I finally decided that I would take this memo directly, not to the media, but directly to the members of the Joint Intelligence Committee. And I didn't even...
Yeah. And you chose Richard Shelby and Dianne Feinstein, is that correct?
That's right. They weren't the heads. Dianne Feinstein later became a head of the committee, but at the time she was just a member. And the reason I got their names from a newspaper article where I saw that they were asking questions that actually were a little more astute questions than that. By the way, most of Congress didn't even know any of this at the time. They were in the dark, completely in the dark. And so their questions of the FBI director, for instance, didn't even make sense because they didn't know any of this. So they're asking questions that were just out in left field. Well, I saw a couple, one by Feinstein and Shelby that, they were a little bit more, getting closer to the truth, I thought. So I put their names on. One was a Republican and one was a Democrat. And the reason I thought I would take the memo directly to them was that I thought there was maybe a possibility that the staff itself, hired by, again, this Joint Intelligence Committee staff, was being guided by some retired officials that had themselves been accused in prior inquiries. One was a retired FBI attorney who had been accused of withholding information from the John Danforth inquiry of Waco. Once you start talking about this, it is a real twisted thing because these agencies always want to put the best face on, and bureaucrats, careerists want to put the best spin on really sad, terrible mistakes that have occurred in the past. And rather than just blurt out the truth and say, we're sorry, this went wrong, whatever, they almost always try to put the best spin on it. And so this former FBI attorney had been accused of not, telling the full truth to the Danforth inquiry. I actually knew him a little bit, and I thought to myself that it probably wasn't true exactly. I didn't really believe that he had withheld information, but I thought there was enough chance that he could still, he had the power to, anything I said in that interview didn't have to go any further. And so I thought, well, I'll just make sure that this memo, then I'll put it in a memo form and I'll make sure it goes directly to, they probably won't read it. I actually did not even have hopes that these senators would read it. I had it in an envelope that said confidential, and I took it to their office in the Senate Hart building. kind of a funny story, because when I got done being debriefed by the the Joint Intelligence Committee staffers, which took place in FBI space, and we were minded. You couldn't really speak freely because I had FBI officials listening in to everything I said to those staffers, and they could even stop me from talking if they wanted to. They didn't, but they could have. They call it minding. You're being minded when you talk, and this is even to Congress. This is what I don't think the American public understand. Maybe they do now with this kind of real partisan wrangling that's going on, but this has always been the case. Secrecy is power. And so, people don't want the truth to come out, and they will do everything they can. Anyways, at the end of about a 2-hour interview where I told them, most of what I remembered, they said to me, is there anything, have you left anything out? Is there anything that you want to make sure we know? And I said, well, if there is anything I left out, it's in this memo. And then I pulled out this 13-page memo that I had written. And as I handed in the memo, they kind of looked at me like, whoa. And I walked out. And so I gave them this memo. And then I took a copy of the memo to the FBI director's office, because of course he's the buck stops here, and he's the first. It was directed addressed to the director. These offices are hard to find in the FBI because it's a real. The J. Edgar Hoover building is just this tangled hallways, and it's very hard to find things.
Yeah, I read that in the interview. That it's unbelievable, like in a maze, So
yeah, They have color lines on the hallways. So you're supposed to follow these color lines to go, oh my gosh, it's like a mess. J. Edgar Hoover was kind of a sadist because he doesn't there's no windows in that building, and it's just like a tunnels. It's almost like tunnels. Wow. It's a mess. Right. So I found the director's office. Then I also took a copy to the Office of Professional Responsibility, which is the internal affairs for the FBI, so that they could, see if they wanted to investigate this. And then I got a cab and I went to the Senate Hart Building. At the time, the Senate Hart Building, you couldn't get into it. It was a huge, long line because the anthrax letters had been sent to the Senate building, and people had been exposed to anthrax, and so they had top security, and you couldn't really get into the Senate Hart Building. So I talked to a security guard, and I said, I showed him my credentials, and I said, I have to get to 2 Senate offices with this confidential memo. And so that guard escorted me to both of those offices. And I left a copy, not even just hoping that they might read it and basically be able to finally at least ask some more intelligent questions, because they didn't even understand what had happened. This is, again, 8.5 months later, and they really had no idea. So after I left those, I caught a plane right back. I took the cab to the airport and flew back here. And about 2 days later is when someone from the probably someone in Congress, I don't know, staff or somebody, must have then called CNN, New York Times, and said, there's a lot more to 9/11 here. We got this memo, and that's when it started to leak.
I see. And then what happened then? Were people inviting you on to interview at that point? Because I know you did some fairly large interviews.
Well, yeah, there was a media short, whatever they want to call it, a media frenzy for a couple weeks. I had the Time magazine photographer and reporter down in my driveway. They didn't even leave at night. They were hoping to take a picture, of me coming in and out of my driveway. My house has a back way in, and so I went up the back way, and never kind of basically cheated them out of a picture and stuff. They found an old picture that they put on their magazine, just from their old footage, of something, because I didn't even stop to get a picture. And then New York Times called, and other reporters were calling me at the time, and I didn't really talk to any of them. They the memo within, another day or two, maybe the day or two after the media heard about it. They didn't actually have the copy. And so the FBI, maybe DOJ, tried to keep it from leaking further by classifying it secret. And they've used a pretext of like one word in the memo, the word French was classified. So they used that as a pretext to classify it to try to keep it from leaking. But in fact, Time Magazine and some others within a couple of days got the entire memo. And then, for a little while, there was a bit of a media frenzy. And I didn't really talk to the media at all. I got called within another couple of days by Senators Leahy and Grassley, who were the heads of the Senate Judiciary Committee, because of course they have oversight over the FBI, and all of these things, dealt with their role as trying to conduct oversight. The Senate Judiciary was conducting its own investigation of 9/11. And then I also got called by the two Minnesota senators. I don't know if I got called by them because I don't remember talking to either one of them, but they at the time was Wellstone and Mark Dayton were the two Minnesota senators. And what they did, all four of them wrote letters to the Attorney General and to the FBI Director asking that I not be fired. And the combination of four senators' letters that I not be fired worked. And Mueller said pretty quickly that no, she won't be fired. Ashcroft was a little more cagey about it, and he didn't really promise I wouldn't be fired. He kind of, just was gave a vague answer back. But the Agents Association knew to, because this wasn't about me personally. This was about the agents in the office, that our office had been, thwarted by headquarters. And so the Agents Association obviously took the side of the agents that had been, that they should have been respected, and their information was credible, et cetera, et cetera. So that whistleblowing did not stand me in good stead with headquarters personnel.
Right.
They were very angry about it. And the other group that was angry were the retired agents. Retired agents were under the old Hoover rule that no one speaks out of school, so-called, never embarrass the Bureau was Hoover's rule. And so you could never, ever tell the truth about anything that had happened that was illegal or wrong or a public safety issue. Hoover would not like it. And so that old rule, some agents were still in that mode. And they, wrote me some letters saying, there's an old loyalty poem that Hoover had. This was before my day because Hoover died in 1972, and I did not join the FBI until early 1981. So, but in the years that Hoover ruled, he had this old, I think it's Elliot Hubbard poem about blind loyalty. And I used to be able to recite it. I don't know if I can right now. I've forgotten some of it, but it's, if you can never criticize the organization. If you work for it starts this way. If you work for a man, then, keep your mouth shut and never criticize. Because if you do, the first high wind that comes along will blow you away, and you may never know why. You can Google it. It's the Elliot Hubbard poem, and the title is Loyalty. And for Hoover, blind loyalty was the top virtue. And so if loyalty is the top virtue, then integrity is, way at the bottom. That's it. That's a lesser thing. And a lot of people still have that ethic. They think loyalty matters more than integrity and truth.
Yeah, we'd have a perfect world if integrity was the number one priority, in my opinion. Integrity, you really do. I think in this day and age, especially with there's so much information out there, and if you have it and it's something that needs to be disclosed, I encourage people to do so. I mean, you'll still, I know there's always backlash, and I guess I wanted to see if you were affected in any other way as well, because we know there's backlash from sometimes speaking out, and you've kind of indicated a little bit like people unhappy at the bureau in certain departments, but you were regarded as a hero, it seems to be. And one of the things, to kind of go off on a different topic, I said, like, I believe that the landscape of whistleblowing has changed dramatically over the years, but and you may have a different opinion, what your experience was, but in 2002 you were kind of lauded as a hero for your whistleblowing, and in the past few years whistleblowers seem to have been targeted, smeared, blacklisted, and potentially murdered and put in prison. So there's definitely been a big change in attitude, and maybe a little bit down the road when we're speaking here, you can kind of tell me why you think that is and what has occurred, in your opinion, that's kind of created that shift.
Yeah, I think that that Time magazine of 2002, which was called The Whistleblowers, the persons of the year were the whistleblowers, went a long way towards making people think that it was good and right to tell the truth.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't just the FBI case. That was Enron and WorldCom, these big corporations where everybody goes along with the lies from the top on down until the whole thing crumbles, and all the shareholders and all the employees and investors and everyone loses everything.
Right.
And of course, those big debacles are lessons. And so for a short while, at this moment in 2002, the mainstream media and the public and people in power weren't necessarily cool with it all, but a lot of people understood the need for truth telling. I always thought it was funny that people weren't more understanding of the need for truth telling, because in the FBI, as the investigators of, for instance, corporate fraud, healthcare fraud, even defense military fraud. I mean, all the frauds that the FBI would investigate over the years, guess what required? There's no way the FBI knows these things. They will never be able to figure out a Bernie Madoff. 10, 15 years, they'll never be able to figure that out on their own. They absolutely require a whistleblower to come in, write them a letter and say, I want to get this off my chest. I've been the bookkeeper for Bernie Madoff, and he is cheating lots of people. It requires that kind of whistleblowing.
Right.
And so in the FBI, like I worked on mafia and mob stuff in New York City.
I know.
And the only way that we could make an inroad into the organized crime was if we got information from, maybe not a whistleblower, could be an informant or a cooperating witness. They're all the same, by the way. These are all interchangeable, except that in some cases informants have their own incentives, etc. But and so you have to beware of different motivations and things. But you have to have that information from somebody that tells you the truth. And so it's pretty odd that an agency that recruits and encourages whistleblowing and encourages people in the public to tell the truth about stuff would then turn and say, but we don't want to know anything about ourselves. I guess it isn't so incredible, but people will like it if it's the airing the dirty laundry of somebody else, they'll be fine. But if it's themselves, their own institution, and this can be everything from the Catholic hierarchy,
Yes.
It's good. Otherwise, good people get locked into this groupthink and blind loyalty of their own group. And they think that their goals and their mission of their entity is more important than the ways and the process. It's always ends justify the means. The people who are covering up for the pedophile priests thought, well, our religion is more important. Maintaining people's faith and trust in Catholicism is more important than telling the truth about these pedophile priests. And so people are always doing this. They're making an ends justify the means, especially the people who are in power in these various groups. And what happened is, after this 2002 moment passed, for instance, in my own case, I didn't stop. Of course, things got worse after 9/11. They used the exploitation of it was even worse than the failure that allowed it to happen. There were 3,000 people that died on 9/11. You know how many people have died since? Millions of people have died. It's horrible. And so this thing just got worse and worse, and nobody opened their mouth about any of that. There was a roundup of innocent people in New York City after 9/11, and everybody kept their mouth shut for a couple of years about that. They started to take people to black sites. Mueller at the top of the FBI, who now is considered this pinnacle of integrity, he never made a report that he knew of that people were being tortured. That's completely violates both domestic, constitutional, and international law to torture. And Mueller, he just swept it under the rug. He told
You're the second person who's kind of at your caliber who's mentioned Mueller's how he chooses his integrity. And I hate to say that because I do like him, but you're the second person who's mentioned something very similar. He chooses it. Depends, as long as it's not going to affect him.
There you go. That's exactly. Yeah. I wrote an article about Mueller and Comey, both of them, because they got this reputation now because of the partisanship on the liberal side, and it's really hypocritical because the liberals were always criticizing the FBI and the CIA, but now they think that these leaders, who by the way worked under the Bush administration and really signed off on all kinds of highly illegal things, but they're very careful. They're very good politicians, and they know how to pick and choose what will make their reputations, burnish their own reputations. And in fact, if you really look at the facts of Mueller and Comey, they were involved in all kinds of different, the same, line of scandals, the anthrax, the targeting of the wrong person in the anthrax case that they ended up having to pay $5 million to. Mueller goes all the way back to the Whitey Bulger cover-up in Boston, where the FBI was operating this murderous Irish mobster for 20 years, and Mueller probably knew about it. He had a role in that. Anyways, I wrote a whole memo detailing some of these factual things about Mueller and Comey. Some of the problem is that leaders who rise up to these positions have learned the art of compromise. They've learned the art of almost kind of manipulation, etc., because that's what goes into their leadership. And a lot of people just fall for it. They want to believe so hard in their group's leader that they don't really are not objective. It's almost reminds me of Billy Graham. You know how Billy Graham could get all those people to believe that he was healing them, and thousands and thousands of people. Oral Roberts. There's been a whole bunch of these, because the people in the group are so inclined to want to believe their faith, their blind faith. They're so inclined to put their trust in this person at the top. And that was the case with J. Edgar Hoover, but it's also the case with Mueller and Comey and before them, Louis Freeh sometimes presidents, depending on your partisanship, whether it's Clinton or whether it's George Bush. It's very strange now that some of our, George Bush, for instance, who really started all of this, post 9/11 stuff, is now being lauded as a good guy by liberals. You'll hear interviews now, and there's even a book out that I saw an interview on NPR where he's being touted as this great guy, and of course, you're so much better than Trump and all the rest, and that's nonsense. He's one of the people who started this. He fueled terrorism. It's incredible how little critical thinking there is in the public, and it's frustrating to have been a whistleblower and to have seen how this is all one thing's led to another, and then of course they have children and grandchildren who are facing the consequences of this really very dangerous stuff that has occurred. Increasing terrorism and confronting nuclear-armed countries now, and it's just really scary.
Yeah, seems to be. So we have about less than 10 minutes. So I kind of want to go into about what you're doing today and also maybe going into, I know that you ran for office and you didn't succeed, but is there plans to maybe run again and in what capacity?
When I retired from the FBI, I initially thought I would, I was only 50, and one of the remedies from the 9/11 Commission report, 3 of their 40 recommendations were to create a civil liberties oversight board. This is all before anyone knew Snowden or NSA whistleblowers. No one knew they didn't even know about torture. In 2004, the 9/11 Commission, by the way, some of them knew about torture. So they had recommended that a Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board be formed. And I thought, well, that's great. I'll get on that. That will be a way that I can really contribute here, based not only on my legal background, but, I thought I could do something. And I actually was able to get, I think, 8 of our 10 Minnesota congresspersons to recommend me to Bush at the time to be a member of that. And Bush, though, did not want to have any oversight. Of course, no oversight at all over what was going on. So he made sure that the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board was under him in the White House. And he dragged his feet, but eventually there were 4 Republicans and 1 Democrat put on this board. And after a year or 2, not very long, I think the Democrat wrote a report saying, we're being thwarted. We can't do anything. We're not being allowed. We're completely being restricted. And he said, I resign. And so and they didn't have subpoena power or anything. So it went into limbo for until Obama got in. And it went into limbo until the Congress changed its majority to Democrat. And when that happened, they actually passed an independent Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. And in the meantime, I had run for Congress as a Democrat in Minnesota and lost. And so when they reconstituted this Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, I again went to all of our, congresspersons here, and I, with the exception of one that was a Republican who, of course, said, oh, you are a Democrat, I can't support you. But the rest of them, I still got 5 or 6 to support me in a bid to be named. Obama, though, however, even though this board was reconstituted, he didn't want it either. The notion that one party is better than the other is completely nonsense. My experience is that the power is making these people. It's not the opposite. And so he did the same thing. He drug his feet. It took years and years, and finally, of course, I was not one selected. He finally got it. He finally had 5 people on this board. They did not have their first meeting until after the Snowden disclosures. That was the first time. From like 2004 when the law passed until about 2013 or so. I think it was, I don't exactly remember when they had the first meeting. It was a long, years and years and years from a recommendation of the 9/11 Commission. And that's a pretty good, interesting point just to compare with how quickly the Bush administration said, we got to go to war in Iraq, we got to torture. All of those things happened within days after 9/11. The one fix that would have made sense, which was oversight over this out of control, illegal stuff that was going on, took years and years and years to get into place. But that's what I really wanted to do. I was never picked for it. And running for Congress, the only good thing about it, I used to say it was like a march into hell for a heavenly cause, because you really see how corrupt the whole electoral process is. Mm-hmm. People know Bernie Sanders complained, the Sanders supporters complained the system was rigged, and Donna Brazile has written a whole book about some of these highly irregular funding. But it even before Citizens United, because I ran in 2005 to 2006, it was already really corrupt. The big money There is no way a normal, good person who does not want to sell their soul actually in the first week to get these millions of dollars that are required. Even for a congressional race, it's a minimum of at least $2 to $3 million for just a congressional race. For a Senate race, it's somewhere around $20 million. So unless you're an independently wealthy, if you're Bill Gates or somebody like that, or obviously Trump's thought City had money, but if you have to be independently wealthy, or you have to be willing essentially to sell your soul. I think if the public was more knowledgeable about the process, the electoral process, they wouldn't have the stars in their eyes that they have, and they would be more capable of judging these congresspersons and senators, because really they have to sign off on things, especially to the defense industry, to obviously to the gun and the weapons industry, but to the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, all of these huge special interests now, these big funders that essentially they are picking the candidates. The people are not picking them. Big money is picking the candidates. So it's impossible to run unless, I always told people if I won the lottery or something, I would definitely think about it if I had several million dollars. But you can't do it on your own. Absolutely impossible.
Right.
No democracy.
Okay. Well, that's good information. And what about advice for other whistleblowers? Do you have advice for them?
There is one way that is more likely to get a result, and you have a better chance. It's the qui-tam process. You have to fulfill some requirements. There has to be a false statement in, like a grant, where it's a tax money that is funding a national grant. Let's say healthcare, for instance. If you know of a doctor who's fudging their scientific results and they are getting a federal grant, and it goes back to the False Claims Act in the Civil War, because during times of war, there's a lot of defense contractor fraud. So let's say you were making toilet seats for the Pentagon, and you found out that they were overcharging $1,000 per toilet, $10,000 per toilet seat. If you knew that, you could file a qui-tam lawsuit under seal, and you would be the whistleblower. And then the Department of Justice has a chance to review those lawsuits. In some cases, they may actually take your side. By the way, it's a small percentage of cases.
Right. And I know last week I asked you the same question, but it's really important to reiterate that. And do you have any links or anything you would like to, anything you want to share with the public? I've written 2 articles. One is on the intelligence ethics issue, and it's on the war on terror. If they put in Coleen Rowley, The False Promise of the War on Terror, I think is the title. That's one of my better articles. And the other one is WikiLeaks and 9/11, What If? Thank you. There we go. And you know what? You mentioned torture earlier, so that's a great segue to introduce my next guest. I have the John Kiriakou, and a man, the highest character who served jail because he refused to participate in torture. So we'll be back after this break, guys. Thank you, Coleen.
Okay, bye. Good luck, Ella. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Hello and welcome back to Whistleblower Nation here on Revolution Radio. Again, I'm your host, Ella, and who I have with me now is John Kiriakou. Do I have you on the line, John?
Hi, Ella. You sure do.
Oh, great. So everything went unhinged. Great to hear. So I'm going to give him a little bio about you. I'm going to start it with one of your quotes. There are some things we should not do, even in the name of national security. I really like that quote. That is your quote, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
You never know. Sometimes you can find things online, so I want to confirm that. And so John is a former CIA analyst and case officer, a former senior investigator for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and former counterterrorism consultant. While employed by the CIA, he was involved in critical counterterrorism missions following the terrorist attacks of September 11th in 2001, but refused to be trained in so-called enhanced interrogation techniques. And John never authorized or engaged in these techniques. After leaving the CIA, he appeared on ABC News in an interview with Brian Ross, and during which he became the first former CIA officer to confirm that the agency waterboarded detainees and label waterboarding as torture. And Kiriakou interview revealed that this practice was not just the result of a few rogue agents, but this was official U.S. policy approved by the highest levels of government. And the government started investigating John immediately after his media appearance. 5 years later, the government finally succeeded in piecing together enough information to criminally prosecute him. He became the sixth whistleblower indicted by the Obama administration under the Espionage Act, a law designed to punish spies, by the way, not whistleblowers. And so John is the sole CIA agent to go to jail in connection with the U.S. torture program, despite the fact that he never tortured anyone. Rather, he blew the whistle on this horrific wrongdoing. So what a pleasure to finally have this opportunity to interview you.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Okay, so as you know, I mentioned to you, this is kind of a tribute to you. So, we have close to an hour. So maybe if you want to add a little bit to that, like share a little bit about your background, if you like, and your educational background, and maybe your life before serving our country.
Sure. I was born and raised in Western Pennsylvania, a small town in a rural part of the state, about an hour north of Pittsburgh. And I left just as I was turning 18 to go to college at George Washington University here in Washington. I got a bachelor's degree in Middle Eastern Studies, and then I was working on a master's degree in legislative affairs. It was just before I finished my master's that I was recruited into the CIA by one of my grad school advisors, who was actually undercover as a grad school advisor. He was really a CIA officer acting as what used to be called a spotter, looking for grad students who might be a good fit in the CIA's culture. So after I graduated with my master's, I joined the CIA and started working as an analyst. I spent my first 8 years as an analyst working on Iraq and served overseas a couple of times in the Middle East. I was in headquarters by 1998, and I switched to counterterrorism operations, went through the operational training, went back overseas again. After the September 11th attacks, I became the CIA's chief of counterterrorism operations in Pakistan, and led a series of raids one night in March of 2002 that resulted in the capture of Abu Zubaydah, who we believed at the time was the number 3 in Al-Qaeda. That was incorrect, but we believed he was the number 3. And we caught, I'm not allowed to say the number, but we caught many dozens of additional Al-Qaeda fighters that night. I returned to headquarters by the end of May 2002. And as you noted in your introduction, I was asked if I wanted to be trained in what they called the use of enhanced interrogation techniques. It was a torture program. I said so at the time. I declined. I'm sorry to say that of the 14 people that they asked to be trained, I was the only one who said no. And I'm glad I did. I have no regrets. I left the CIA in 2004 and went into the private sector. And then in 2007, I gave that interview to Brian Ross at ABC News, in which I blew the whistle on the torture program. So it's been an odyssey, really, since 2007. I was investigated for a total of 4 years by the FBI, but it wasn't the Bush administration that went after me. It was the Obama administration.
Interesting.
I gave the interview, as I said, in December of 2007. The FBI investigated me from December 07 to December 08 and then closed the case and sent my attorneys a declination letter declining to prosecute. They concluded that I had not committed a crime. A month later, Barack Obama was inaugurated, and the CIA asked Eric Holder to secretly reopen the case against me, which he did. I had no idea I was still under investigation. And for the next 3 years, they tapped my phones, they intercepted my emails, they had surveillance teams on me. And then finally, in January of 2012, I was charged with 5 felonies coming out of that interview, including 3 counts of espionage.
My gosh,
so,
what was going on in your head when you heard that sentence? What were you thinking?
Oh, that I would jump in front of a subway train.
Oh, I can only imagine.
Plain and simple. How do you come through something like that? I was facing 45 years in prison. I knew in my heart I hadn't done anything wrong. I hadn't committed espionage. That was ridiculous on its face. And by the end of the year, those charges were thrown out. But it becomes an economic decision. I'm glad we have some time. I'll explain how this all played out. In my attorney's first conversation with the Justice Department, they made an offer, and they said, take a plea to an espionage charge and you do 10 years. And I said, I'm not going to do 10 minutes. I've not done anything wrong. Well, what the government normally does, if you turn down that first offer, they'll come back with an offer of 12 years and then 15 years. But when they came back with their second offer with me, it was 8. And then the third offer was 5. And one of my attorneys said, I've been an attorney for 40 years, and I've never seen them do this before. And I said, well, why are they coming down in time? And he said, because they have no case, and they know they have no case. So finally, they came down to 3.5, and they said, best and final offer. And I decided to turn it down. And so they said that if we were to go to trial, they would seek 45 years, which was a death penalty. I'm 53 years old. I was 48 at the time. It's the death penalty. And I knew from a study that was released right around that same time by ProPublica that the government wins 98.2% of their cases. And besides that, I had hired O.J. Simpson's jury consultant. He happens to be the uncle of my best friend's wife. And
I was just going to ask you, how did you end up with him? Okay.
And he volunteered his very, very expensive services. So he flew up. He flew up from Dallas, and he got a security clearance from the Justice Department, and we went over the entire case. And finally, he said to me, look, if we were in any other district in America, I would say, let's go for it. We're going to win this thing. But you're in the Eastern District of Virginia. They call it the espionage court because no national security defendant has ever won a case there. He said they would convict a bologna sandwich if the government asked them to. And he said, look at what your jury's going to be. Your jury's going to be CIA, FBI, NSA, Homeland Security, Pentagon, intelligence community contractors, and their family members. You don't stand a chance. Take the deal. And so we went back to the Justice Department and we proposed a year. They came back with 2.5, and we decided to cut our losses. You know, one of my attorneys said to me, because I was going to turn down the 2.5, and he said, you just don't understand. You think this is about justice, and it's not. It's about cutting your losses. And finally, another one said, if you were my brother, I would beg you to take this deal. He said, this can be a blip in your life, or it can be the defining event of your life. Make it the blip. And so I took the deal.
And I guess, you know, then you went into the system, and how did you cope? What was it like? Was it different than you expected? And I'm sure this was an opportunity to spend time to educate yourself, and really, I'm sure if someone's sitting in the system like that, that gives you an opportunity to start doing research and, you know, try to
yes and no. Yes and no. You're not allowed any computer access. So research is difficult. But here's how this worked. My attorneys asked the judge to send me to a minimum security work camp. Now, in a work camp, there are no bars on the windows. The doors are not locked. You're free to come and go as you please. You're on your honor not to abscond. And most people work in town at a local university or whatever. And minimum security camps are generally attached to high security or higher security prisons. So the prosecution had no objection, and the judge ordered that I be sent to a minimum security camp. So I was assigned to the prison camp at Loretto, Pennsylvania. And I turned myself in on February 28th, 2013. I drove up to the prison, and you literally knock on the door and say, "I'm John Kiriakou. I'm here to turn myself in." And so they put you through the metal detector, and then the corrections officer began to lead me around to the back of the actual prison. And I said, "No, I'm supposed to be at the camp across the street." And he laughed and he said, "Not according to my paperwork, you're not."
Oh my goodness.
So I told myself, take it easy. There's nothing you can do. If you flip out, they're going to put you in solitary. So I just remained silent.
Right.
And to tell you the truth, I was probably in shock too. So I was processed, and it took me 5 days to get access to a telephone. And when I finally did, I called my lead attorney and I said, "Hey, they put me in the actual prison with the pedophiles and the murderers and the drug kingpins. So what do I do?" And he said, "Oh my God, well, we could file a motion, but it'll be 2 years before we get a hearing and you'll be home by then. I'm sorry, buddy, you're going to have to tough it out." And so I decided that day that I would rely on my CIA training to make sure that I remained safe and at the top of the social heap. And what I ended up doing, I ended up writing a book. And I won one of the country's 4 top literary prizes for this book. I won the Penn First Amendment Award. And I called the book "Doing Time Like a Spy: How the CIA Taught Me to Survive and Thrive in Prison."
It kind of ties into the Patriot Act, how it's supposed to be for spies, and you're not even a spy. So interesting.
Exactly.
Good title.
Exactly. And so I wrote down these 20 life lessons that the CIA taught me, and I showed how I used each one of these to stay safe.
Right. Well, that's great. And so that worked out for you. And did time go? Did it go fairly quickly once you were there and you were in the routine?
It did. Once you get into the routine, it goes very quickly. In the beginning, well, you know what? I was walking around the yard one day with a captain from the Bonanno crime family. He lived in the cell across the hall from me. And he said to me, "How much time do you have anyway?" And I said, 30 months. And he said, "Oh, you could do that standing on your head." I said, "You know what? It feels like 30 years. And he said, "I'm going to give you some advice. Don't tell anybody that you have 30 months. Because most of these guys are here for 10, 15, 20 years. And if they hear that you're here for 2.5, your safety is going to be in jeopardy. So if anybody asks you, you tell them you have 5 years." And so that's what I did. I told everybody that I had 5 years. And then on the day of my release, the cops put up a sheet every day at 4:00 that lists the next day's meetings. And one day it said Kiriakou R&D 0700, that's receiving and discharge. And somebody saw it and said, "Are you getting out tomorrow?" And I said, "Why?" "Because you're on it's called a call-out sheet. You're on the call-out sheet for R&D. I thought you had 5 years." I said, "Yeah, I have 5 years. I'm just mailing a package. That's all." "Oh, okay."
Yeah.
Yeah, so I very quietly went to R&D the next day and I walked out.
It's just hard for me to even understand how someone, you're so different compared to, people. I know I've talked to other whistleblowers who have served time in different capacities, or at least a couple of them. And you're a person with such high character, and you served your country, and you have such high integrity, and to be in there with real criminals, I'm sure that was very difficult.
Thank you. And the prison is fully a third pedophiles and other child sex offenders, which made it even more difficult because you just want to kill every one of them.
I'm sure that's just disgusting, but you made it through, and
you know what? Let me interrupt you for a second.
Sure.
I made it through, but not without some challenges, and I want to tell your listeners about one challenge in particular because it's a lesson for all of us, right? Especially in America of 2018. One of my attorneys told me, he said, I'm going to give you a bit of advice that I know from other clients who have had to go to prison. Don't trust anybody. And I mean literally anybody. He said the FBI is upset that you got off so easily. They really wanted you to go to prison for 45 years. So don't trust anybody. They do this to organized crime guys all the time. They're upset because these organized crime guys have short sentences and they set them up while they're in prison. And I said, okay. And I filed that in the back of my head. So I had been in prison about 6 weeks. And a guy who lived in my housing unit, he was an Afghan American. He was a pharmacist who had a bad OxyContin problem and was doing 8 years. And he, very, very nice guy, lovely guy. He just happened to have a drug problem. Right. And he belonged in rehab, not in prison. But anyway, he came up to me and he said, hey, John, there's a new guy here that wants to meet you. And I said, yeah, who's that? And he said, he's the former spokesman for the Taliban. And I said, the former spokesman for the Taliban? You know what? I remember that case. It was from like 2003. He was in on a gun charge, but he had been the Taliban spokesman inside the United States. And they got him on a terrorism conspiracy and a gun charge. And I said, nah, no thanks. I don't want to talk to him. I don't want to meet him. He said, okay, I'll tell him. Well, a few days later, I'm out on the yard, just walking the track by myself. And this very obviously Afghan-looking man with a long, bushy beard walks up to me with his hand outstretched to shake my hand. I put both of my hands in the air because I immediately assumed that either the cops or the FBI were in the woods with their long-distance cameras to take a picture of me embracing this convicted terrorist. Mm-hmm. So I put my hands up in the air and I said, back off. And he said, oh, come on, man. We have a lot in common. I said, we have nothing in common. I spent my career trying to kill people like you. Mm-hmm. Oh, no, don't be like that, he said. And I said, look, I'm not going to be able to say it in any more clear language. Leave me alone. Come on, let's just talk. I said, leave me alone before I do something that both of us are going to regret. And so we walked away. Well, the main point of this story is this guy had been in my prison for 3 days. And 2 days later, he was released. So why in the world would this guy have been in my prison for 5 days on a conspiracy to commit terrorism with a gun charge? Right. Because he was planted there by the FBI to entrap me. And that's what the FBI does.
Wow, they really had it out for you.
They really did. You had Coleen on your show earlier, correct?
I did, yes.
Well, Coleen really gave me some great advice. I relied on Coleen and on other colleagues of Coleen's to just make sure that I was pointed in the right direction. Whenever I had a question about tactics, like the story I just told you, I knew I could rely on Coleen and she would give it to me straight.
Yeah, she's a straight shooter. Yeah.
She's the best.
She really is. It was a really great interview. So you spent your time there, and you wrote a book, and then you're out. And how did that go? I don't want to go to too much personal life without your permission.
Oh, sure.
I know you had to get back into the world and readjust. What did you do when you were released?
Well, most people, when they're released from prison, they think they can just step back into their lives again and everything's going to be fine. And that's just not true. It's far, far more stressful when you first get out because you're assigned to a halfway house. Now, I didn't have to spend any time in the halfway house. I checked in, I was there 9 hours, and they sent me home. So I was under house arrest for the next 87 days. But house arrest is very difficult because it means that you literally cannot leave the four walls of that house. You can't walk to the curb to pick up your paper. You can't go sit on the deck in the backyard. You are inside the house for the next 87 days. And the halfway house calls you constantly during the day. And by God, you better pick up the phone. Because if you don't, then 2 cops are coming to the house to get you and take you back to prison. In the meantime, the only time you are allowed to leave the house is to go to the halfway house, to be drug tested, to be harassed. You have to promise that you're looking for a job, and you have to outline all the different jobs that you're looking for. Well, that's onerous in and of itself. And I'll tell you another thing, too. They have these mandatory classes at the halfway houses. There are 16 mandatory classes, and if you don't take them, they violate you and you go back to prison. But these classes are nonsensical for somebody like me. Suicide prevention. I said, don't you think you should have given that class before I went to prison? I'm thrilled now that I'm home. I don't need the suicide prevention class now. It's kind of like closing the barn door after the animals have already gotten out.
Right.
Another one was how to write a resume. Thank you very much. I know how to write a resume. How to conduct yourself in a job interview. Again, I appreciate the thought, but I don't need your help to get through a job interview. So I don't know if it was anger, rebellion, arrogance, maybe. I didn't sign up for a single one of the classes. And so I get a call one day from the director of the halfway house, come in immediately. So they wouldn't allow me to drive. The halfway house is literally 7 miles as the crow flies from my house. But it would take me 2 hours to get there because I have to walk a mile to the subway, take the subway to Capitol Hill, and then get on a bus, which takes me to literally the worst neighborhood in the worst quadrant of Washington. Get off the bus there and walk another mile to the halfway house. So it was quite an ordeal. So I got there 2 hours later, and everybody's there. The director and deputy director of the halfway house, a representative from the Bureau of Prisons in Baltimore had driven all the way to Washington, my case manager, the drug counselor, and a social worker. And I go in, and they all have their angry faces on. And the director said, we're discussing whether or not to violate you. I said, okay. You haven't taken any of the mandatory classes. What do you have to say for yourself? And I said, and this is exactly how I said it, did you ever see that episode of The Simpsons where Homer has to take a parenting class and he goes a couple of minutes late, and when he walks in, the instructor is saying, put a garbage can lid on the garbage can, people. I can't stress that enough. Is that what you're going to teach me in your mandatory classes? To put a garbage can lid on the garbage can? I said, I don't need your stupid mandatory classes. It's a waste of my time and of your time. I would rather be spending that time finding a job because you people consistently harass me because I haven't found a job. Well, guess what? It takes me 2 hours to get here, 2 hours to get home, an hour that I have to do your stupid drug tests and waste my time talking to you. That's 5 hours that I could be out looking for a job. And they're all just looking at each other. Step outside, please. So I step outside. So 45 minutes later, they call me back in. They said, okay, we've waived the classes. And I said, okay. And another thing, I want permission to drive. I'm tired of taking the bus. I'm tired of wasting my day coming up here. All right, you have permission to drive. And once I laid out those markers, I was okay. They knew that they couldn't push me around because I wasn't afraid of them. You know, just like I told the warden one day, and I put this in my book too, he was trying to threaten me because I had been writing this blog from prison, and it was the blog that led to the Penn First Amendment Award. And he wanted to put me in solitary. He was threatening me. And I said, Warden, with all due respect, I have gone nose to nose with Al-Qaeda, with Hezbollah, with the Iranians, and I'm supposed to be afraid of you and your solitary? I said, please, you've never served in Yemen. I can do solitary standing on my fingertips. And then he backed off. They always do. Because if you show them that you know the rules better than they do, and that you know that you have not given up your First Amendment right to freedom of speech, they always back down.
Well, it sounds like it. Well, you put them in their place.
I tried. It was risky, but I succeeded.
Well, that's the important thing. You know, and you do have to take a stand. I mean, you'd already been through so much as well, and it seemed to have worked out for you. So
it did.
I guess there's a few things I wanted to go into and delve into a little bit more at some point, in whatever order you choose. But like I wanted to go into the acts of terror or the acts of torture and some of the laws surrounding that and what that entails. I'm very interested in that. And then, what you're planning on doing in the future, what work you have lined up, and then maybe go into whistleblowing in general as well as a closeout to kind of give advice or to talk about what we need to do to protect people like you so this doesn't happen to them. This is unacceptable. People, I talk to a lot of people, and I don't know if you know this, people revere you. I'm surprised how many people know you, and they revere you and your character, and they say only the kind of things about you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, that was my impression when I talked to you on the phone a year ago. You just sounded like such a sweet, wonderful man. I think Bill Binney had somehow suggested you or mentioned you or something.
Oh, Bill's a giant.
Oh, he is. The reason why I do what I do is because of him. I interviewed him on a different podcast at one point, and he is a hero. And talking to him and Kirk Weavy,
and a role model.
Yes, I mean for Edward Snowden, and he did what he did because of Bill Binney was his hero, and so speaking with those two men changed the course of my life. All of a sudden I had this interest in people like you, and then working with other people, other human rights activists, and people who are also being tortured or being subjugated by the government in different capacities.
Yes.
So, it was very concerning to me. So here I sit because of those two men.
Wonderful.
So, yeah, they're really delightful people. So anyways, so I guess whatever order you want to, broach those questions.
Sure. Well, let's start with torture. When I was first approached, it was kind of an odd experience. I was in the cafeteria at the CIA. I had just gotten back from Pakistan. And a senior officer of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center came up to me and he said, "Hey, welcome back." I said, "Yeah, thanks. Good to be back." He said, "Yeah, I'm glad I ran into you. I wanted to ask you, do you want to be certified in the use of enhanced interrogation techniques?" And I had never heard that term before. And I said, "What's that mean?" And very excitedly, he said, "We're going to get rough with these guys." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" And so he laid out these 10 techniques from what they called the attention grasp all the way up to waterboarding, and 2 techniques that I always believed were worse than waterboarding. And I said, "Oh, that sounds like a torture program."
Can you share those 2 other things, or not allowed to?
Yeah, sure. No. It was sleep deprivation and the cold cell. And I'll get into those in a second.
Okay.
I said, "That sounds like a torture program." No, he says, we got it approved by the president and by the Justice Department. And I said, "Yeah, you may have, but," I said, "listen, just in my gut, I have a moral and ethical problem with this." And he said, "Okay, suit yourself." As it so happened, I was passed over for promotion a month later. Now here I had just caught the number 3 in Al-Qaeda, and they passed me over for promotion. So I went into the deputy director's office. I had worked for him years earlier. And I said, "What do you mean passed over for promotion? What, do I have to catch bin Laden to get promoted around here?" And he said, "Well, we talked about you in the promotion panel, and you didn't want to be trained in the enhanced interrogation techniques." And his exact words, "That displayed a shocking lack of commitment to counterterrorism."
Oh, my.
Well, the station chief in Pakistan for whom I had worked had been promoted to be the associate deputy director of the whole CIA. And he made me his executive assistant, and he promoted me. So I got the promotion, but I realized I'm on the other side of this thing. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of lonely over here. But I thought, I grew up in a very progressive household. My parents were, followers of the news. I remember when I was 6 years old, and I remember this very vividly, and I've talked to Daniel Ellsberg about this. But when I was 6, Dan released the Pentagon Papers. And of course, it was major national news. And even as a 6-year-old, I remember my parents talking about it at the dinner table, because we always talked about the events of the day at the dinner table. And in our house, Daniel Ellsberg was a hero. He was a hero. He was somebody to be emulated. And so from when I was a kid, I was never really afraid to stand alone. Because if I really believed in my heart that I was right, then that's all that really mattered. And so I stuck it out, and I refused to be trained. So, these techniques, some of them clearly were not torture. If I grab you by the lapels and I say, answer my question, doggone you, that's not torture. But they very quickly progressed into torture. For example, one of them was called walling, W-A-L-L-I-N-G. And that is when a prisoner has his hands tied behind his back. A towel is wrapped around his neck to prevent whiplash. And then he's slammed into a wall. Now, the wall has to be fiberboard or something akin to fiberboard because you don't want to cause permanent damage. And that towel is supposed to cushion the blow. So Abu Zubaydah was a victim of walling, but they didn't wrap his neck in the towel, and the wall was made of concrete. Now, there's another prisoner. I don't know if I should say his name or not. I won't, just to be on the safe side.
Right. Who
was walled repeatedly to the point where he has permanent brain damage and is unable to participate in his own defense. So how is that legal? The other two techniques that I told you I had particular objections to, besides waterboarding, which everybody knows about, were sleep deprivation and the cold cell. Now, sleep deprivation sounds like no big deal. And in 2002, the Secretary of Defense at the time, Donald Rumsfeld, famously said that he didn't believe that there really was such a thing as sleep deprivation because he can go 48 hours without stopping, his work, and his desk is a stand-up desk. He doesn't even have a chair, and so he doesn't believe that sleep deprivation is a problem.
You keep him up for a week and see what he says.
Exactly the point. We know from the American Psychological Association that people begin to lose their minds at day 7 with no sleep. They begin to die around day 9. Well, the CIA was authorized to keep people awake for 12 days. So how is that legal and moral and ethical? The other one is the cold cell. The cold cell is very simple. A prisoner is stripped naked. He's chained to an eye bolt in the ceiling so that he can't sit or lay or get comfortable in any way. His cell is chilled to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And every hour, a CIA officer goes into the cell and throws a bucket of ice water on him. We killed people with that technique. We killed them. Now, I understand, actually, like intellectually, I understand when President Obama said we need to look forward, not backward. I get it. If you're a CIA officer and you've been told that you're operating within the confines of the law and you do what you're told to do, I understand. But no one was authorized to murder prisoners. Nobody. And there was never any justice for those people that we killed.
What about, I'd heard another person tell me that they would have them like masturbate and do and hold really uncomfortable poses. Is that true, or is that something you were aware of?
I have never heard that, at least not in the CIA context. Now, I'm not an expert on what happened at Abu Ghraib, which was a military torture program, a rogue torture program. That would not surprise me at all if you told me that had happened at Abu Ghraib.
Yeah. So, so I'm just curious if that was something that was across the board, or this is specific. Like you said, a rogue group would have their own rules. So.
And there were other things that CIA officers did, especially to Abu Zubaydah, that have been outlined in the Senate torture report that were never authorized and certainly never prosecuted. We knew, for example, that Abu Zubaydah had an irrational fear of insects. And so they put him in a box, like a coffin, and then they poured a container of cockroaches in on top of him, and then closed the coffin and just listened to him scream. How is that legal and moral and ethical? Yeah. It can't be. It just can't be.
It's repulsive, actually. I don't even know how they come up with these things.
It is. It is.
Who does come up with these? I'm just curious. I know it's a need to know. I've talked to enough people in government to know it's always need to know, and you don't get too much information. But I'm very curious who sets these standards, or who sets these policies, or
these all came out of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. All of them. Yep.
Okay.
Now, they didn't invent them. Chinese communists used them. The Belgians used them in the Congo 120 years ago. The Chinese used them back in the 14 and 1500s. These are old techniques, but they were used because they work.
Right.
And this is another issue too. I debate a lot of people in public venues, whether they're at universities or radio or television shows. I debate people who are they wouldn't call themselves pro-torture, but certainly pro-enhanced interrogation techniques. And their argument is that these techniques worked. Well, first of all, that's not the issue. It doesn't matter if they work. And first of all, what does work mean? It got somebody to talk? Lots of things can get people to talk. Raping them gets them to talk. You going to rape them? I mean, we don't, because it's an abomination. But if you want to get them to talk, killing their children in front of them would work. Are you going to do that next? Raping their wives in front of them? That might work. So it's not an issue of whether it works. I'm going to sound like a broken record. It's an issue of whether or not it's moral, legal, and ethical.
Right.
But that's not the argument that the government wants to hear.
When do you think this all came out of 9/11? These type of interrogation methods. That's what I thought.
Yes.
Yeah. So many of the problems. The Patriot Act has caused just
the Patriot Act,
wormhole of problems.
Warrantless wiretapping, mass surveillance. All of these were byproducts of 9/11, which makes me conclude that here we are all these years later, and Osama bin Laden won. He wanted to affect American society. He wanted to crash the economy and affect society. And he crashed the economy. He put us into a permanent wartime economy. He put us into a period where we spend untold trillions of dollars on national defense.
Yes,
We've lost our civil rights and civil liberties. We have a Patriot Act. We have secret FISA courts. So bin Laden won.
That's unfortunate. So what do you think is going to have to happen? Is there anything kind of moving ahead to kind of protect human beings from being tortured? I mean, I know they're working on the surveillance aspects, although I don't know. It doesn't look like a win situation at all. What are your thoughts?
Not yet. Yeah, on torture, we've had a couple of positive forward progress. First of all, Barack Obama signed an executive order his very first week as president, banning the enhanced interrogation techniques. That's all fine and good. An executive order has the force of law, but it can be changed by the stroke of a pen from the next president. So it was a temporary measure, a temporary halt. But in the summer of 2015, Congress passed the McCain-Feinstein Amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act. It also has the force of law. It was passed into law, and it limits the techniques that can be used to those techniques outlined in the Army Field Manual. That's great, but what's to keep a hawkish president from just changing the Army Field Manual?
Right.
Another important point, too, Ella, to make is that we already have laws on the books that govern these kinds of things. We have the Federal Torture Act of 1946, which specifically banned exactly these techniques that you and I have just been talking about. In 1946, we executed Japanese soldiers who had waterboarded American prisoners of war, right? That was a death penalty offense because it was considered torture. In January 1968, the Washington Post ran a front page photograph of an American soldier waterboarding a North Vietnamese prisoner. The day that picture was published, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, ordered an investigation. The soldier was arrested. He was charged with torture, convicted, and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Well, why was torture illegal in 1946 and illegal in 1968, but somehow not illegal in 2002 or 2015? The law never changed. We changed. We changed as a people, as a nation, and shame on us. So we need to get back to our roots. We need to get back to a rule of law. Yes, 9/11 was traumatic. Believe me, I was in the building at the time, Like everybody else in the building, I volunteered to go to Afghanistan or Pakistan and to do whatever my country needed for me to do. But my God, we can't lose the sense of who we are as people.
Right.
We're supposed to be the good guys.
Yes. And the way things have been going for the past decade or so, it doesn't seem indicative of that at all. So.
No, not at all.
So what's your plan? What do you have next? What are you going to be doing next with your life? And is there work on the horizon, or what projects?
Yeah, I've got a couple of things going. I have a daily 2-hour radio show here in the Washington area.
Oh, you do?
105.5 FM and 1390 AM. So it's on from 4 to 6 p.m. and it's a news show. We have guests and talk about all the issues of the day, which is a lot of fun. It's a good fit for me. And I have a weekly syndicated column with reader-supported news. That keeps me busy, too. I'm working on my 4th book right now. I made such good friends in the mafia while I was in prison that they've asked me to write a book about them. And so I'm writing a book about the mafia.
Interesting.
Not to say that there really is a mafia, right? There's
right.
no such thing as the mafia. Okay. So
just a group of men who are in power in the underworld.
Misunderstood guys.
Okay. Interesting.
And then, even before I got in trouble, as a hobby, I like to write television pilots. And I've sold 7 over the years. And I came up with an idea when I was in prison that I thought was my best idea ever. And I sold it to MGM. And to make a long story short, they've ordered a pilot. And it's the first time I've ever made it to pilot. And so I'm going to go to Los Angeles. We just finished the 5th draft of our script. I'm going to go to Los Angeles in a couple of weeks, and we're going to pitch it to networks and hope for the best.
Yeah, that's funny because I did get a question from Kate Ryan. I believe you know Kate Ryan. She's a dear friend of mine.
Yes, I sure do.
Lovely
person.
Oh, just a decent human being. And she had wanted me to ask you about the TV series that you planned on doing with Oliver Stone, she mentioned.
Yeah. So Oliver, as soon as I got home, Oliver called me and said, let's do something together. I said, I'd love to. So I went out to Los Angeles. I have great representatives out there, a terrific agent, and I love my entertainment lawyer, and they're really great. And so Oliver and I went to the History Channel, and the History Channel optioned, it's funny, they optioned 1 chapter from my first book, and they wanted to do this series based just on that chapter. And it was about life inside the CIA immediately before, during, and after 9/11, and how this organization of thousands of smart, patriotic people went from being smart, patriotic people and then 6 months later ended up with a secret prison system, a torture program, and extraordinary renditions. And so we developed the series together and made it to the end, and then the History Channel canceled it. They said it was too expensive to produce. And that's okay. That kind of thing happens. Like I say, I've sold 7. And on this other one, I finally made it to pilot.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear. Great to hear. And then I had a couple of questions. I guess she was going to ask some of John Whitehead's friends, but I'm not sure. Let's see what the questions. Oh, I want to ask you about Jeff Sterling. I've been working with Holly, and we've had some scary things happen. I don't know if you would.
Yes.
I think you were already at that point. I was just disgusted. She called me. Kate put me in touch with her, and we were really concerned about her husband. He was having heart issues, and boy, I got the press on them. Yeah, right. I got the press on that, where he was at, and I just was very concerned. She did say he did kind of get some help, and I just really did my best I could with people I know to ruffle some feathers. But it's another case where it's just I feel for her. I like her so much. I like him so much, and I haven't spoken to him, but I speak to Holly, and so I don't know what's going to happen out of that. I'm not sure. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, Jeffrey's still in the halfway house, and they're making his stay there very difficult. They won't let him have a telephone because BOP regulations are such that you're not allowed to have a cell phone if it has a camera and if it has internet. Well, every cell phone has a camera and internet. So in every halfway house but Jeffrey's, you have to white out the camera and just promise them that you won't surf the internet. And if they want to check your phone, they have the right to check it. With Jeffrey, just because they're actively trying to be as difficult as they can with him because they don't like him, they just won't let him have a phone. And so it's hard for him to stay in touch with Holly. At the same time, Jeffrey is like me in that he doesn't need to learn how to write a resume. The guy's an attorney and a decorated fraud investigator.
Exactly.
So he doesn't need their stupid classes. They're forcing him to go through the classes. And instead of just sending him directly home to home confinement, just to harass him, they've kept him at the halfway house. So they've told Holly that he's not even eligible to go home until this coming Thursday. Holly purposely has not gone to the press because she doesn't want to ruffle the Bureau of Prisons' feathers.
Right.
And we have to wait and see until Thursday to see if he comes home. If he doesn't come home, I told her that I was going to write about it again. I'm in very close touch with them. And so, I don't want to make things difficult for him. And at the same time, we just can't abide this kind of behavior from the Bureau of Prisons. It's discriminatory.
And to give maybe people, you probably can word it a little bit better, give a little history about Mr. Sterling, what happened to him.
Yeah, Jeffrey Sterling is a bona fide whistleblower. He was a CIA officer in the agency's Iran Operations Division. He's also African American, which is very important in this story. Mm-hmm. So Jeffrey was involved in an operation that he believed constituted waste, fraud, abuse, or illegality, which is the definition of whistleblowing. He went to his superiors. They told him to mind his own business. And so he complained up the chain of command, which is exactly what you're supposed to do. When he didn't get any satisfaction there, he went to the Congressional Oversight Committee, which is also exactly what you're supposed to do. And so as punishment for going to Congress with his concerns, he had an assignment rescinded. He was supposed to go to the Middle East, and they yanked the assignment out from under him. And when he asked why, his supervisor said, well, we thought it would be funny if, not funny, haha, but funny, odd, for a big black guy to be speaking Persian, Farsi. And Jeffrey responded, when did you realize I was black? And so they said, well, we're going to send you to Germany. Well, his things had already been shipped out to the Middle East. So he said, I don't want to go to Germany. I was told I was going to the Middle East. Well, how about we just fire you? And they fired him. So he filed a racial discrimination suit, which, believe me, enraged them. The thing is the CIA has long been guilty of racial discrimination and sex discrimination. It was only in the 1990s that women were given equality to men in the CIA, at least in the operational division. So,
Coleen and I have had some conversations about that, so she validates exactly that statement.
Oh, it's just dreadful. In fact, there was a class action suit of female officers that was settled in 1993, and in the settlement, in the decision, the judge said he had never seen a case where the defendant had so fully documented the charges against itself as the CIA had done.
Right.
Crazy. So Jeffrey was fired. He filed a racial discrimination suit. Well, James Risen of the New York Times covered that story. And so Jeffrey and Risen spoke, as it turns out, 52 separate times, never for more than a couple of minutes. At the same time, Risen wrote a book called Bush at War, which talked about this Iran operation that constituted waste, fraud, abuse, or illegality. Now, there was someone on Capitol Hill on the Senate Intelligence Committee who was thought to have been the source, Risen's source for that story. The CIA, of course, pointed the finger right at Jeffrey, and they said, you're a malcontent. You complained about this program. You're talking to Risen. You're Risen's source. Jeffrey said, I'm not Risen's source. I have been talking to Risen. It's been about my racial discrimination suit, which he has covered in the New York Times. Well, the Justice Department decided there's no sense in going after this guy on Capitol Hill when we already have this guy, Jeffrey Sterling. We're going to go after him. They repeatedly offered Jeffrey deals to plead guilty, just take the deal. And he refused. He refused for a total of 11 years, right? Or not 11, I guess, minus 2, 9 years. And the reason he refused to take the deal was because he was innocent.
Yeah.
And he told me, he said, I thought as soon as I got in front of a jury, they would realize how ridiculous this was. Well, remember, I said in the beginning of our conversation, the Eastern District of Virginia, look at how your jury is made up. They would convict a bologna sandwich if the government asked them to. And so Jeffrey was convicted on 9 felony counts, including 7 counts of espionage. The only thing that saved him from dying in prison was just serendipitously his sentencing date came the day after David Petraeus' sentencing date. And so Judge Brinkema, even though she's a hanging judge, she was my judge, she was Jeffrey's judge, and she already assigned to herself the Ed Snowden case. She said in good conscience she couldn't give him what she had wanted to give him because of what Petraeus had gotten. He got a sweetheart deal.
Oh, we're about to go
so
now. I'm sorry. We're running out of time here, but I want you to go ahead and say one more time what you're doing, and I'll discuss Jeffrey next week as well. So can you give what it is you're doing, your radio show,
thanks.
your book? Okay.
Yes, I have a radio show on 105.5 FM in the Washington area from 4 to 6 in the afternoon, Monday through Friday, and a weekly column at readersupportednews.org.
And your book?
My book is Doing Time Like a Spy, How the CIA Taught Me to Survive and Thrive in Prison.
And it did. Well, thank you, John, so much. I appreciate it, and I really enjoy this. Thank you, John. Have a good one.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.